And welcome once again to Flashpoints. I'm Bob Orr, and as always, joined by Juan Zarate, our national security analyst. Juan, good to see you.
Good to see you too, Bob.
Major story this week involving, once again, Pakistan. We know what happened on the border, 24 dead soldiers. There's been some finger pointing back and forth, but the big story here is what this does to our relations.
Right, yet another moment of crisis that presents a potential rupture in the relationship. And Bob, we have to remember, though our sort of memory of events with Pakistan tends to be episodic depending on what's on the front pages, for Pakistan, this is part of a series of events over the last year and a half, 2 years, that have been an affront to their sovereignty. And so now they have 24 of their soldiers killed by NATO forces. They had the UBL raid. They had Chairman Mullen accusing them of colluding with the Haqqani network and others. They had the Raymond Davis affair. The recent resignation of the U.S. ambassador to the United States because of allegations that the U.S. was going to get involved in a potential coup or avoiding a coup in Pakistan. So the U.S. is seen as not a friendly actor at this point, and this just heightens the tension. And so what we've seen from the Pakistani government is what you'd expect given the political tensions and demands internally. They've shut off the supply routes that we depend on largely through Pakistan into Afghanistan to supply NATO troops. They've demanded the closure of a drone base in Baluchistan, which is part of the drone network the U.S. uses. And they've boycotted this December 5th Bonn conference, which was supposed to be a major international conference on the future of Afghanistan. So this is a really big deal, and we've got to keep in mind how this impacts the Pakistani mindset.
It almost seems, I mean, to the layman, it almost seems like this is just one event too many. I mean, on top of all the things you mentioned, now this happens. They've got to explain that locally. And we haven't, this country has not done a particularly good job, I don't think, of explaining what's happened there. We keep saying we don't know.
Well, I think that's part of the difficulty. And you've seen some difficulties in terms of communications out of the White House, for example. They haven't wanted to put the president out there either apologizing or giving any explanation, in part because it's not clear. And, you know, to be fair here, you know, the Pakistanis have to answer some questions too. There was a firefight underway. NATO troops, Afghan, U.S. soldiers were under fire. You know, Kim Dozier, formerly CBS News, now AP, wrote a story saying perhaps it was the Taliban. And one of the theories is the Taliban actually, you know, was instigating
maybe
this,
baiting
the U.S. and baited the firefight. Whatever was happening, there was a firefight coming out of the Pakistani border area and perhaps even out of the environs of these border posts. But what it suggests is there's not only kind of a breakdown of trust, but a breakdown of processes. How do both sides ensure that this doesn't happen again? How do they know where their troops are? And how do they identify each other? Because it may have been simply a case of mistaken identity that has now ballooned into a major diplomatic crisis.
I guess the one unifier that remains, though, is we both need each other still.
Yeah, it's a bad marriage. We've talked about this over and over on Flashpoints. It's a bad marriage where we need each other. The U.S. needs Pakistan not to fall prey to the instability internally, the extremists. They've got nuclear weapons. We need stability between Pakistan and India, and we need Pakistan for the future of Afghanistan. In particular, if we want reconciliation talks with the Taliban, Pakistan's important. Pakistan needs us too. They need our money, they need our influence, they need our stabilizing effect. And so, like it or not, we're stuck in a bad marriage.
Second stop today on Flashpoints is Egypt. Huge turnout for the elections there. This is going to be very interesting. Now, they haven't really announced all of the results, but the indications are the Islamists early on have a pretty good hold here.
Right. It appears Muslim Brotherhood's coming out and saying that the Freedom and Justice Party, which is their political arm that competed in the elections, did quite well. And there was huge turnout. It wasn't violent, which was interesting because we are coming on the heels of some of the sectarian problems we've talked about between the Christians and the Muslims, the Coptic Christians, and then the protests that we were seeing in Tahrir Square, people losing patience with the military junta. And so it was actually pretty remarkable. You didn't see any fighting, any major violence, any problems, frankly, with the process. The real question is the election credible? Is there a sense that this is actually legitimate? And actually, you heard a lot of comments from people who went to the polls, you know, Democrat dissidents, people who had been part of protests, saying, "Look, I don't have any faith in this, but I'm gonna participate so that I put the onus on them, so that I've made my mark, and now I can demand something of the military elite and of the government." So there was a lot of sort of cynicism going into the election, but people were coming out in droves because they want to force the process. And I think that's really interesting. But to your point, there's a real challenge here, not only internally within Egypt, but for the United States, if in fact the Muslim Brotherhood gains greatly in these elections and becomes basically the dominant political power to then determine the constitutional framework for Egypt. Because that's really what's happening here. This is the first stage of the parliamentary elections leading then to presidential elections. So the question is, if that's the case, how does the military react? Because the military and the Muslim Brotherhood may have a marriage of convenience for now, but they don't like each other. And the military certainly doesn't trust the Muslim Brotherhood. And secondly, how does the U.S. deal with the Muslim Brotherhood? Keep in mind the Muslim Brotherhood is not only a force within Egypt, but is the brother organization to groups like Hamas in the Palestinian territories. And so we have to really come to grips with the fact that we have an Islamist party gaining power in one of our key ally states.
I guess ultimately the people and the major institutions like the military will decide in their minds whether this was legitimate and whether the result stands. But how much time has to pass before we can say, yes, this appears to hold?
Well, part of this is the elections were ongoing, so it wasn't just a one-day deal. So part of this is just getting the votes counted, but there has to be a sense that the results reflect the will of the people who've taken to the streets and otherwise. What's interesting in some of the early reports, and maybe this is a little bit of politicking, folks are saying that the ex-Mubarak folks who were running, the old regime autocrats who were running under different party names and under different hats, did quite poorly. At least that's what the message is. And so if it turns out that the people who were tied to the military end up looking very good in the polls, coming out very favorably, that's going to create a deficit of trust in the election results, and you're going to see, I think, massive protests. But we'll just have to see. I think the people will determine whether or not it's legitimate, and part of that is the numbers and the results. Part of it is how the results are declared.
So we keep an eye on Tahrir Square again.
That's right.
I guess,
That's
right?
exactly right.
Third stop today is Somalia. This is getting more interesting by the moment because we've talked about al-Shabaab in the past. We've talked about the fighting there in that country, but now we have other parties joining the fight. What's going on there?
Right. And we've talked about the Kenyan government actually invading Somalia, starting to go after the al-Shabaab movement, in particular in the south. The Kenyans have an interest here because they've had instability leaking over their borders. They've had tourists taken hostage, French woman killed. But they've also had a flood of refugees coming into Kenya as a result. And frankly, they had just had enough. And we talked about this in a Flashpoint episode where the Kenyans decided it was time to take action. So they went in. What's interesting about this now, Bob, is this is starting to take on the flavor of a much more aggressive regional approach to solving the long-term Somalia problem. So this isn't just Kenya deciding to go in and deal with some training camps or al-Shabaab militants that they're worried about. This has started to become, from a Kenyan point of view, and also from an Ethiopian point of view and a Ugandan point of view, a moment to work with the Somali authorities to actually get Somalia right. And what's great about this, from my perspective, is it's a moment for the regional countries, the powers, to actually start to take real ownership over what has been a failed state and a real problem for the international community for over 2 decades. And so, I don't think it's an easy endeavor. In fact, most commentators are saying that Kenya has gotten itself into a world of trouble because how do they get out of this now? What's the exit plan? And to the extent that there are foreign forces in Somalia, the Somalis don't react well to foreign incursions, and that the al-Shabaab movement used the Ethiopian invasion in 2006 to great effect to organize and to galvanize the diaspora community and donations and such. So the real question is, can this actually be a transformative moment where the Somalis and the key regional partners actually try to clean up and stabilize the country? Huge homework assignment, huge problems, but they're at least thinking in those terms.
Kind of like regional nation building.
That's exactly right. And for some of us who've been involved in this business for a while, I think this is exactly the approach that the world has to take on these issues, whether it's Somalia, whether it's Yemen. We dealt with some of the problems in Southeast Asia this way. It has to be a regional collective effort because these problems aren't just contained to one country or one country's interests. It involves a lot of countries.
Somalia needs a functioning government, though.
Needs a functioning government, and the Somalis have to take ownership of this at a certain point. It can't be imposed by the African Union, by the United States, by the UN, or the Kenyans. At a certain point, the Somalis have to get this right for themselves. and that's been missing for over 2 decades.
I'm intrigued by the title of your fourth topic today, Qatar, diplomatic heavyweight, really? Small little country?
Qatar, the size of Connecticut, punching well above its diplomatic weight, and it has started to do this over the last 4 to 5 years, but it's really started to get a lot of attention. Part of the reason I wanted to give this view to you and to the viewers is there's a lot of talk about this, and it's important to watch because as you watch the diplomacy, for example, around the isolation of Syria, the Arab League deciding to sanction Syria, kick them out, which is a major move with respect to Syria, that was led by the Qataris. They have led it diplomatically. They've been the voice of it. Their foreign minister has really been the voice of isolating Syria. And it's not the first time. They did it with Libya. They were the primary voice. They sent military aid, humanitarian aid, supported politically, and are deeply involved in Libya. They did it as well a couple years ago in the resolution in Lebanon, where they served as the grand arbiter between the warring sides. And so Qatar has filled the void here, and they've done it largely with influence through their money. They're very wealthy, not that many people, and they've got huge natural gas supplies. They've done it with their influence, for example, with Al Jazeera, which they control. So a huge megaphone for the regime, able to spotlight certain problems or aggravate certain issues. And they've done it with their territory. This is a country that bases one of the most important U.S. bases and provides all the logistical support and financing for it. And so they are very savvy at using their influence. They've started to punch above their diplomatic weight. And they're doing it not just for economic reasons, but for diplomatic reasons.
And are they being viewed on all sides as kind of an impartial arbiter, like with good standing?
Great question, because they are not. They're not trusted, which is interesting. I mean, they're serving a very important role, and from the U.S. perspective, a very good and important role with respect to Libya and Syria. But overall, they're viewed with some skepticism, in part because they have relationships with Islamists in the region. Many say that part of their influence and part of their strategy has been to align with what they see as the Islamist movement gaining sway in the region. So, for example, they have hosted for a long time key Hamas fundraisers and voices like Sheikh Qaradawi, well-known in the region, a huge fundraiser. So they have tended to be viewed as opportunistic, where they play multiple sides at once, and so they have a great relationship with the United States, but at the same time play footsie with Iran. And so they are not seen as a neutral arbiter, but they're seen as an arbiter that has great weight and is certainly punching above its weight class.
Some people might say that if you keep kind of all sides a little uncomfortable, you might be in a good spot in terms of leveraging. Yeah,
I think you've got to be a little bit careful, though, because they're in a dangerous part of the world, and they've got big neighbors all around them that at a certain point may determine that they're not willing to play the game anymore. But Qatar has been very smart about this. They know how to use their money, their influence, and I have more and more friends every day, you know, U.S. and other friends who are going to Doha for all sorts of things. Remember, they won the 2022, I think it is, World Cup bid, and they've seen that as a major coup, part of their coming out party. So Qatar is important to watch in the region, and it's important for a lot of reasons for the United States.
We have put Qatar on the map today. It's diplomatic.
That's right.
Juan, very interesting. Thanks as always.
Thanks, Bob.
And thanks to you for watching Flashpoints. We'll see you again next time. I'm Bob Orr.